Well, there we go. I think we have jumped online. So very good evening and welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, presented by Pick and Pay. And thank you for joining us this evening as we hang out with some pretty cool people. One of them is a recent Diners Club Winemaker of the Year who swapped Constantia for Durbanville and is now back in Constantia at one of South Africa's more iconic estates. And we also speak to probably just the godfather of wine in South Africa. I don't think we can specify judging or writing or buying, or he's just the general godfather of wine. We've had him on the show in one of our longer episodes a little earlier this year. In fact, it was 2 episodes as we charted his extraordinary wine journey. And tonight we talk to him in the context of the awards that he has just been judging. And we'll jump into those in just a second. Before we do that, to let you know a couple of things should be up, I think first thing tomorrow morning. There's a piece we were down at the launch of Plaisir with Michael and Rose Jordan. We caught up with them and we had a look at how Plaisir de Mel has become Plaisir and what they've got planned going forward. A couple of wine luminaries in there. Look out for people like Skulk Willem Joubert sticking his head in with a few comments on one of the great old estates of South Africa. You might have been looking out for a couple of members of the Cape Winemakers Guild, the Protégé program this evening. They'll be joining us on Monday evening and we'll be coming to you live from the kitchen of David Higgs. David and I have got a dinner we're hosting together for some guests afterwards, and we'll be preceding that with an evening with the protégés of the Cape Winemakers Guild. Their wine arrived today. I'm looking forward to meeting them. I'm looking forward to tasting their wine, and I'm looking forward to celebrating a program that is delivering year in, year out some serious young wine talent into our industry and strengthening it year by year. So that is all over the next few days. Also, next Thursday, we'll be down in Cape Town as we broadcast live ahead of Drink Chenin Day next Friday. So start getting those Chenin Blanc stocks up and raring to go. So we're off to Constantia a little later on this evening. We chat to Danie Kuelder with his Constantia Uitsig wines, formerly of Natida. If you go back a bit, also Groot Constantia, and now back firmly entrenched in the Constantia wine valley. But we kick off with one of my favorite lunch companions. He is a treasure trove of stories, not just of the industry, but of life in general. And as I always feel it's very important to point out when in conversation with him, he is a former international cricketer, which I think is his most important claim to fame. A very good evening, Mr. Michael Fridjhon.
Good evening, Dan. I'm as much a cricketer, sir, as you are a winning golfer, which I believe is your record for the day.
It is indeed a fabulous triumph over John Smith, and it would be petty of me to point out that we crushed him and his team by 7 points over the 18 holes at Royal Johannesburg, and so I don't want to rub in the margin of our victory, but gee, it was great to win today. It's also great to be drinking wine, to be doing so in your company. So welcome back to Dan Really Likes Wine after a fairly busy stretch, Michael, because you've had what is, I think, along with WineX, probably your...
Dan, I've lost you. I've lost you. Dan. Dan. We've lost each other.
Oh, there we go. I think we've lost you there for a second.
You come back. There you are. A long stretch you were saying of judging wine.
Yes, which sounds very onerous because you've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bottles of wine that you have to sift through. And initially, oh, that's cool, I get to drink loads of wine. I suspect it's a little more difficult, a little more challenging than that.
Well, in fact, my job is far and away the easiest of it all because there are teams of judges, panels of 3 judges, each for every class. And their job is to do the real sort. And my job is to make sure that they don't break each other's arms and legs when it comes to deciding which are the best wines in the class. So the way the Old Mutual Trophy Wine Show works, there are primary panels, 3 judges each, and they work through various classes. So typically the Shiraz panel would work its way through 70 or 80 Shirazes, ditto the Cabernet panel, the Sauvignon Blanc panel, etc. And all of them, once they've done that, arrive at a point where they say, we have or do not have gold medals, we have some silver medals, we have some bronze medals. My job as show chairman is firstly to make sure that they're all calibrating to the same kind of level of bronze, of silver, and of gold, so that what we think is complex enough to be a silver medal is the same across all of those classes, across all of the days. So I taste quite a lot of wines on the cusp of in or cusp of out, one of those medal categories. I then look at all their gold or gold candidates. They're usually quite controversial in the sense that one or two members of the panel do or don't believe in them. So we discuss them, we work our way through, we arrive at a final list of gold medals. And all of the gold medals from the 3 days of primary judging are then reviewed by all of the judges, including me, for the final day where we determine the trophies, the best in class, and all the other fine wines that have to be listed from the actual judging itself.
So it's a fairly comprehensive process. How much wine are we talking here? How many people are entering, and how much wine are they entering?
Okay, so, typically, and I think a COVID year has seen a decline in numbers, typically would be at around 1,000 wines. This year we were at 650 or thereabouts, in fact, nearly 700 at the end. And so over 3 days, we work our way through 220, 240 wines. Over a normal year, it would be closer to 300 or 320, which means that the burden of judging for the primary panel on every day is somewhere between 80 and 100. And that's quite a heavy workload. And I must say the one blessing of the COVID is that those lower numbers means that every single wine gets taken to pieces. The judges didn't have shorter judging days. They were in right from the beginning, and they worked their way through all of those. And at the end of the day, depending on the class, there would be, from a class of 60 to 80 wines, there would probably be 15 to 20 from each of those panels for me to review. And in the end, and it's an extraordinary stat which we've just picked up, that our gold medal count over the 20 years history of the show has been less than 2%, and our silver medal count is less than 10%. So on a day of looking at 80 wines, you'd have a couple of golds, and you'd have somewhere around 6 to 10 silver medals.
So it's a very stringent process. There are a lot of people overseen by you keeping an eye on everything and determining what gets what and how something is judged in very simple terms, in the most laymanish, so even I can understand them. How do you set out a framework for something like this so that the consumption of wine, which is such a subjective space, what I like you might hate and vice versa, how do you turn that into an objective analysis when you've got so many different people who've got their own palates, who've got their own thoughts, their own preferences, conscious and subconscious, and collate those into what is as accurate and meaningful an assessment as you can make?
Okay, so there are a few things. Over the years, in fact, since I think 2007, I've been running a wine judging academy in conjunction with the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business. So all of our judges have in fact graduated, all with distinction, from that judging academy. So there's a certain discipline already to the way they actually look at wine and wine judging. Secondly, I have a kind of guideline on aesthetics, which I have to say I discovered quite, I have to say flatteringly. The late Stephen Spurrier, the man who set up the famous Judgment of Paris tasting, and who had judged twice at the Old Mutual Trophy Wine Show. He died earlier this year, and I managed to get a hold of a copy of his autobiography, which has just been published. And he recounts our judging methodology and then makes it clear that he's taken some of that advice to his role as chairman of the judges for the Decanter World Wine Awards. There's a sort of mnemonic that everyone has, but it's about looking for detail and nuance and persistence and equilibrium and all of those not big things in wine. And I always say to the judges that very big showy wines always do well in shows and come round to haunt the judges afterwards when people think, how could anybody have fallen for so obviously a salacious bottle of wine? But so with a guideline that we really think has worked over the years, that is about detail, nuance, complexity, intricacy, the judges at least have a certain kind of focus. And it is extraordinary when I look over the 20 years of the show, certainly the last 10 years since we've had graduates from the academy. Every year, there are more than 50% of the gold medal and trophy winners have been previous winners at the show. And in certain categories where we know a producer is competent and strong, they just pop up every year in top silver or in gold. So that tells you that panels which change over the year. So it's not the same panel in 2020 and in 2021. The judges are able to hone in on those more refined, more pure, more linear, more complex styles of wine and extract them from this wide range of different styles which are on the tasting bench. And they're looking for quality of fruit. They're looking for not overuse of oak. They're looking for ageability, but generally we're looking at young wines that we believe have got the capability of going the distance.
To what extent then is this process of working out what you feel is good versus maybe not quite so good dictated by this is exactly how it should be, or is it at all swayed by the changing of what people are liking drinking, what they're enjoying, where maybe a few years back red wines were all big and huge and showy, and now maybe there's a little more restraint shown and people are enjoying that, or there's not as much wood now in a Chardonnay as there might have been 10 or 15 years ago. Those sorts of changes, do those reflect your interpretation of how these awards work, or do you stick to a pretty straight and narrow path?
No, I think you're quite right. There's an element of fashion that plays a key role in wine. And while we're not fashion driven, all our judges are people who are either making wine, judging wine, writing about wine, acting as sommeliers. So they are people who are engaged with consumers. And over time, all our tastes, all our idea of what is correct, proper, fashionable change. But it's also a rule that I've said to everybody, if you see a really well-made, old-fashioned wine, it's as entitled to reward as something that's very trendy, but which you might have doubts about in terms of its kind of fashion longevity. By way of an analogy, I was out at dinner in a very unusual restaurant where truly they had avocado Ritz on the menu. Now that's about as 1970s as food can be, and it was spectacularly good. It may have been 1970s, but it was artfully done, and every single one of those ingredients was proper and correct. And that's the same view that we take about out-of-fashion wines. If they're really good examples, if they would have done well when the fashion was in the vogue, then they're entitled to a reward at the Trophy Wine Show.
I'm rather partial to an avocado Ritz myself. In fact, I enjoy making one, and heaven help Carl Lambo ever finds out I use his finest Takara brandy when making said avocado Ritz. Things change a little in terms of what we like to drink, so they change in terms of how people are approaching the making of wine and what they're putting out. If you look at this year, any particular trends shining through, anything that really stood out for you in terms of a slightly different direction or a sense of reinvention, perhaps, of where South African wine is for 2021?
Okay, I mean, that's really interesting because there are things that have become increasingly obvious as trends. So we saw, and 10 years ago, we said that South African white wines were dramatically better than our red wines. It's not the case anymore. There are fabulous reds and fabulous whites. So the reds, in a sense, have caught up with the quality of winemaking that we took for granted with the white wines. That's an absolute certainty. Secondly, we are seeing more of what used to be called niche varieties, the kinds of grapes that only a half a dozen people had planted and were slowly making their way into the market. They're there now. We're very conscious of them. Thirdly, last year we launched an Old Vines trophy for certified old vine wines made in accordance with the kind of guidelines established by the Old Vine Project. And last year we had very few entries and none of the best wines. This year we had a significant number of old vine entries and some absolutely spectacular wines. And I think that's a real trend way beyond the show in terms of how South Africa's old vine wines are going to become a real discussion point, not just domestically, but very much in the international markets. So all of those trends were very evident this year. One of the more disappointing trends is the constant and now very visible reduction in the number of fortified wines that are being made and are being entered in the show, which is one of the reasons why I'm drinking last year's museum class trophy winner, which was the 1948 KWV port. It's delicious, by the way, and if it could be tasted through the ether, I'm sure you'd agree. And this is something that South Africa does spectacularly well. We made fortified wines to rival the best of Portugal, Spain, Madeira, Australia, who pride themselves on their paraports and their muscats, their vintage and Tokais. And yet when I look at what has happened to those classes over the years, they've shrunk. And that's because the producers of those wines are battling to find a market for something which really was at one stage a real high point of the Cape wine industry.
It is sad, and we do have some terrific producers. I think of a number of guys in the Carletsdorp area, people like the Nells, who are making some terrific wine. I want to come back to that 1948 in just a moment and talk through it in slightly more detail. Having a specific look at this year. You've been doing wine for so long now, Michael. I don't think you're actually allowed to produce wine in South Africa unless you've sent a bottle to Michael Fridjhon to taste and let you know if you're all right to put it on the market. Was there anything this year that surprised you, that made you sit back and think, whoa, this is different, this is fabulous, this is not something I was expecting?
I mean, there's a trick to that question, because obviously I can't yet give up the results. But suffice it to say that I guess these are things that we would have taken for granted almost. But firstly, the purity of the wines. 10 years ago, if you'd attended the feedback session, what you would have heard from all of the judges is how good the top wines were and how junky almost everything else was past the midpoint. And it was what we experienced when I sat every year as a judge at the initially Tri-Nations Challenge, which ultimately became the Six Nations Challenge. And that is that a lot of South African wines were best in class. We beat the Americans, the Australians, the Kiwis at the best Shiraz, the best Cabernet. We even once beat the Kiwis at the best Sauvignon Blanc. But when you looked at a class where the top 10 or 20 wines were in the medals, there were a few South African wines dotted below 1 and 2. And we didn't have the depth to fight our way through a whole class against the depth of talent, if you like, available in some of those other countries. That's what has changed. So for me, it was that there were very few faulty wines. There were very few corked wines. In other words, the quality of cork coming into the industry has improved dramatically. And of course, a lot of people have moved to screw cap, which has also at that level eliminated that taint. Although we did see for several years that winemakers not managing screw caps properly managed to produce all kinds of other issues like reduction, pong from the sulfur and so on. It was just a much cleaner, fresher, purer, more professional industry than we could have imagined even 5 years ago. We really are there, kind of, dare I say, a bit like our top sporting teams, that while we may not have the population numbers to take on the world, we now have enough depth of talent at the very top that we can indeed take on the best teams from everywhere in the world.
Which leads to a question that I think a lot of people ask when it comes to this sort of space about the awards. When you put them together, very simply, it's about celebrating South African wine, and this is the best of it, and we want to tell the world exactly that. But if you go a little bit beyond that, the purpose of these awards, what ultimately are you trying to have the Old Mutual Wine Trophy say, both to the South African wine industry and about the South African wine industry?
Okay, so when we launched the show, which was in 2002, there was a very clear intention, given that the wine industry was just emerging from a period of fairly extreme isolation. There was a very clear intention to show the world that South African wine wasn't how it had been characterized and caricatured in the era before isolation. So a lot of people had a very, I suppose, historically dated sense of what South African wine was about. We wanted to get the message of new South African wine out to our consumers, but much more importantly, from an industry perspective, to the wider wine world. And so, in choosing the international judges, and in pre COVID times, and hopefully from next year, on every one of those 3-person panels, there is one international judge. And that international judge is firstly chosen because of her judging abilities, their track record as judges, not as famous wine celebrities. And then, secondly, because in some kind of way they have a platform from which they can communicate the story of South African wine. And in the 20 years of the show, I think we can reasonably claim that the absolute leading figures in the world of wine have come to judge, many of them more than once, that they have taken back to their countries and to their readers and to their listeners the story of how South African wine has transformed over this period. And when that message gets to that wider audience, we were the first people who were able to persuade the person who managed the South African wine story for Robert Parker, the most influential American critic at the time. That was Neil Martin. Neil came to South Africa as a judge at our show, even though he theoretically is not supposed to accept invitations from an industry, because he understood it wasn't an industry invitation, it was from the show. And that's transformed his view on South African wine. Jancis Robinson's come a few times. And as you go through that list, I've mentioned Stephen Spurrier, Brian Crozer. If you look at the people who have come to South Africa as judges of the show over that 20 years, and their ability to communicate what has been happening in South African wine to that wider international audience, I think it's fair to say that in that sense, the show has a dual and two-way facing purpose. The first is obviously to send a message to the industry that enables our producers to understand what we perceive as quality and what kind of quality we'd like to see rewarded. And I think we've played a very important role, in making sure that that purity and that linearity and that nuance, which isn't just important to me and to the other judges, but it's really what the international market is going to judge our wines on in time. And then to bring the international judges into that picture and have them communicate that message in the markets in which they have influence, that dual function, I think, has played a very important role in the renaissance of Cape wine.
I think the Old Mutual Trophy has played a big role in our celebration of South African wine, and a big part of that story. It's a story, in closing, that I want to get one last piece of understanding of, Michael, and I think a lot of other people will be interested as well. You have with you the 1948 KWV port, which it could still be called then, which won in its category overall last year. With large glass in hand, as I know you do, explain to us very simply how you judge that wine.
Dan, I think I've lost you. Dan? Dan? Dan, I thought I lost you. Are you there?
All right, there we go. My apologies. The joys of power cuts and power surges. I'm afraid we had one or two issues, but we are back for my final question. I'm not sure how much you got, Michael.
I've got the question about the port and how it was judged.
Please take us away.
Okay, well, the answer is, in a sense, it judges itself. The whole issue around, and particularly fortified wine, is how the youthful, juicy primary fruit finally knits together over many, many years. And what we had with this wine is a wine that the panel knew was old. They didn't necessarily know the vintage. And what they found is that it had become intensely nutty, still unbelievably fresh. There is this thing about old wine that you still want it to be savory. You still want it to have purity. You still want it to have every bit of nuance that you would expect of a young wine. And this port has it all. It's not overly sweet. It's not as dry as port would be made today. It's got a hint of the muscat grapes that were most certainly used then and which aren't really used anymore in the production of port. It has a real intense nuttiness, but it finishes with a delicacy and a lightness. It's not like drinking medicinal syrup. It has an almost ethereal quality about it, and the haunting aromas of a vintage that was harvested 73 years ago have been trapped in this bottle for all of that time, and they have appeared in the glass this evening for me and taken me back to a time long before I was born, when a perfect vintage in the Cape Winelands produced a perfect bottle of fortified port.
It is a bottle I'm hoping to sneak a taste of tomorrow when I catch up with Michael for a quiet lunch. Already sounds like poetry as much as it does wine. And that is the magical touch of Michael Fridjhon, who for so long now has been taking wine and presenting it to us, not just in South Africa, but right around the world. With such expert care and enthusiasm and genuine passion for the subject. Michael, thank you. Final one for you very quickly. When will we know who our old mutual champions and medal winners and prize winners are?
Less than a month away, late June, very early July, in a day and age where award ceremonies, I think, are out of order. It will be very much on social media, online, YouTube, and it'll be out pretty much as soon as we've verified the authenticity of everything that's been entered, all the gold medal winners. We send bottles off for technical analysis to check that it complies with what the Wine and Spirit Board has of the wines in question. And then it's simply a matter of producing the AV equipment that will replace the award ceremony. So hopefully by the end of the month.
All right, there we go. Michael Fridjhon, he tried 650 different wines for this. He does not use a spittoon. He's the only judge on earth who refuses to use a spittoon, drinks everything, and does so very proudly. Michael, thank you very much. We'll catch up tomorrow. Lovely having you on the show again.
All the best. Thank you very much, Dan.
There we go. Michael Fridjhon, the man behind the Old Mutual Wine Trophy, as esteemed a wine show we have, not just in South Africa, but I think almost around the world. It really is held in high regard, and we'll know those results, as Michael says, in just over a month's time. I wonder just how much these awards mean to our winemakers. So let's find out from one of them as we say goodbye to Michael and head down to the Cape, down to Constantia. Last time I caught up with this particular gentleman, he was making wine in the Durbanville area. He's now moved back to Constantia, where he learned so much of the craft to which he is now fated. He's Danie Kuelder, and he is at Constantia Uitsig. Danie, warm welcome. Lovely to see you, and welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me.
You heard all that there from Michael. It was a very detailed look at one of South Africa's premier wine shows and wine assessments of the industry. How much do you guys as winemakers look at these? Is it just about getting a nice sticker to push a few sales, or is there something more meaningful for you as winemakers?
Look, I think it's definitely meaningful. There's a certain side of it. It helps with sales. It's also always nice to hear your peers, what they think about the wines you make. Because remember, up until that point, we look at a totally different product to what actually ends up in front of them. And I actually had a tasting in the cellar this morning with people, showing them the difference between what wines taste like after fermentation, in tank before bottling, and then after bottling. And it's such a vast different. And to be able to see, or to be able to, for us, we always look at it up until bottling, where these guys always look at it from bottling onwards. And to connect those two together from what it should be looking like before bottling and what it is going to look like, 60, 65 years down the line, like that port he had, then obviously we need to be able to understand what they're looking for and to be able to draw the line back to what it looks like beforehand in tank.
Two very important parts of the industry. And I generally like to think they complement each other and together do an important job for our industry. An industry you've been making waves in for some time now. Let's go back to stint one in Constantia as we build up your wine story, and a fascinating story it is. Your time at Constantia working with Bula Gerbo is one of our modern greats. How did that mold not just who you are in terms of the skill as a winemaker, but your philosophy on wine and your approach to making it?
Well, I think it's definitely shaped everything I think about wine and winemaking. Look, that first 5-6 years working under Bula, it was everything you think about, all your philosophies, all the nitty-gritty things about how you market your wines and how you handle everything in the cellar, what the right process is. All those things get molded right in the beginning. And I think later on in life, you start deviating slightly from some of those ideas. And whenever it doesn't work, you always go back to the basics. And I've always learned as a kid that you need to get the basics right first before you can do anything else. And quite often you just stick to the basics, and that's enough. And those are one of the things, for instance, I've learned from Bula. So I absolutely fell in love with Constantia and Sauvignon Blanc in Constantia. Semillon Sauvignon Blanc blends from Constantia. I think it is one of the cooler climate areas that is able to make wines that is drinkable a little bit later in their lives.
And it's a space to which you have returned, but not without a rather successful sojourn a little further north. What was the pull of heading out to Durbanville and going to join the team in Nitida?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that I fell in love with Sauvignon Blanc at Constantia, and because I think about half their plantings is Sauvignon Blanc, so there was quite a lot of different components to work with in the cellar, and that was a big pull for me always. I think I always felt that was one of the cultivars I was good at working with. So I was always looking for something Sauvignon Blanc wise. And when Nitida came along, it was a definite option to look at, and an exciting option to look at as well. At Nitida I think we made mostly Sauvignon Blanc. I think 70% of our production was Sauvignon Blanc or blends thereof. So I said to you earlier, it was seven different styles of Sauvignon Blanc. And to keep head of all those different components that you have, make sure that it's all going to fit into the right style in the end. That was exciting times, and it was fun times as well.
Yeah. It's not unique to Nitida in Durbanville to conjure up different forms of Sauvignon Blanc. We look at Dimmersdale, and they've got about 70. There are lots of different interpretations. The two sides to that coin, I suppose, as a winemaker. On one hand, it's really exciting because you can find different expressions of the same grape and deliver different kinds of wine, different styles, and satisfy both your own interest and excitement, but also different customers. But then on the flip side, you've got to manage all of those. You've got to remember what's where, how does it taste, where does it fit in? And if we're blending some of those together in Sauvignon Blanc, make them work together. Is it a difficult juggle, a tough balance?
Oh, definitely. I think one of the exciting things about Durbanville as a wine growing region and as a Sauvignon Blanc region is the fact that there's so many different pockets, and it's very easy to keep separate pockets separate in your cellar if you've got the capacity to do it, and to keep them separate as long as possible. And through that, it was always very easy to be able to make the different blends into the different styles. Now, one of the fun things, I always find Durbanville Sauvignon Blanc to be there's quite a concentration in the Sauvignon Blanc, and that makes it very easy to have a very specific green type of style or a very fruity style or something that will work with wood. It was very easy from a very early age to be able to differentiate what would be the best route forward for this component of the final blend. That was always a lot of fun, where I find some of the other areas in South Africa with Sauvignon Blanc is not as definite. This is a little bit more sandy spot and a little bit more clay spot and a little bit more afternoon sun versus morning sun, etc. So that's all the fun and funny bits of working in Durbanville.
Yeah, you've mentioned Sauvignon Blanc extensively because it is a grape you are so passionate about, which delivers a certain irony in that what you're probably best known for your time in Natita is actually a Pinot Noir, because it was with Pinot Noir that you won the Diners Club Winemaker of the Year. It's not a grape we tend to associate with Durbanville. It's not a grape we automatically associate with you because we know your love of Sauvignon Blanc so well. It certainly shows us just what a versatile winemaker you are. How did that come about, that this was the grape you won with? And what did winning that award mean to you as a winemaker?
Let me start with the last bit. It meant a lot. It is, like I said earlier in the interview, there's a lot to be said about recognition from your peers within the industry, and it means a lot for having a little bit more trust in yourself about what you're doing, and that it's not always, because we tend to be quite hard on ourselves in general. I think everyone are quite hard on themselves, and to have a recognition of saying, well, what you're doing is actually is tasty, and we like your wines. It's always fun to hear. Pinot Noir in Durbanville, that's always a funny, interesting one. Look, I fell in love with Pinot Noir when I started working at Natita. Absolutely love the cultivar. And I do believe, and yes, it's not an area that's necessarily associated with Pinot Noir, but there is 2 or 3 vineyards that I think is absolutely phenomenal. And to the point that I'm actually trying to get one of those vineyards coming to the cellar in Constantia Uitsig at the moment. I'm trying very hard to fight for that vineyard. But so it's all about exposure. It's all about terroir for Pinot Noir. I think you need to have exposure to wind, maybe a little bit slightly more northernly facing exposure, and also it needs to be a clay spot. And that's one of the beauties that Durbanville have, is all those high quality clay swirls that I think makes a very tight, fruity style Pinot Noir.
It's still, to me, another wonderful illustration of just how much we can do with wine in different places in South Africa, the success that our winemakers have when they put their minds to it. And that Pinot Noir out of Durbanville, one that the judges of the Diners Club Winemaker of the Year Award certainly acknowledged and appreciated. So you made that. You're the winemaker of the year. You own the wine world. You're just doing fantastically. And you said, you know what? I want to go somewhere else. Why the move?
Ooh, it's a very, very long story. Mostly, you know what, I've always been based in the southern suburbs. My wife still works in Constantia. She owns a couple of restaurants in the area. So therefore, it was always been a bit of a travel. And I've always been looking at moving back closer to home. And I have to say, it is actually quite nice being able to be 10 minutes, 20 minutes away from home instead of having to drive an hour in traffic. So if I have to be honest, that's probably mostly the reason why I had to move, or why I wanted to move back to Constantia, closer to home.
All right. Well, it's a move that I'm sure the Uitsig faithful are very happy with, because it is one of South Africa's iconic estates, and that Constantia stretch love of Sauvignon Blanc. Let's jump into that as we sample the first of the 2 wines we have with you this evening, and that is our 2020 Constantia Sauvignon Blanc. As we drink it, I'd like you to introduce the wine to me, but also, if you can, compare and contrast it with the wine in Durbanville, the wine in Natita, not so much from the actual mouthfeel or the nose or what we get in the wine itself, but more from a winemaker's perspective. What is the difference and the challenge and the approach to making Sauvignon Blanc in Durbanville versus Constantia?
So I think I referenced to it a little bit earlier. Soil is a very big part for me of what terroir is all about. So, and it's all about the interpretation of that specific soil type and then terroir by extent. So a big difference for me in Durbanville versus Constantia is clay soils, the Malmesbury, Coffee Clip, those type of soils, a little bit of shale, compared to Constantia area that is mostly decomposed granite. There's a little bit of sandstone in some pockets of the mountain, but mostly decomposed granite. And depending on how high up or lower down you are on the mountain, the more washed out that soil becomes. So style-wise for me, Durbanville grapes tend to show a lot more tiles right in the beginning and even later on in life, compared to Constantia wines that seems to take a little bit of a quiet time for the first 9 months, and then only start showing the real true colors of what it really is doing. Something else that I always find with Constantia wines as well, it's got a definite minerality. Now, I know minerality is a very wide concept to use in wine, but I think everyone I've spoken to understands the concept of what minerality, a type of metal flavor, rock, sort of almost licking on a rock type of taste that you get. That for me is a very typical Constantia wine. Now, the biggest thing is of that, I think most of the wineries in Constantia only release their Sauvignon Blancs round about 9 to 10 months after vintage. So something you need to keep in mind when you're making a wine in Constantia is that that will be the release date. So it doesn't help you make a upfront showy something that's very much influenced by yeast for the first 6 months and then start losing a lot of those flavors. You rather want to make something that is really true to its core, a little bit stronger, a little bit heavier, something that will show 9 months to 2 years after vintage.
The wine we're drinking now is a 2020, so it's had just a little bit of time in bottle. It's a Sauvignon Blanc that I think speaks very much to Constantia and to the broader style of Constantia wine. Is it something, though, that might change ever so slightly? Because you're coming in as a winemaker who's got Constantia experience, you've got Durbanville experience, you've got a couple of nice big shiny titles from the stuff that you've done before. To what extent do you now try and imprint your own philosophy, your own approach to this wine? Or do you kind of just leave it as it is and let the terroir, let the conditions tell their own story?
Look, I often say, I think us as winemakers think too much about ourselves. We make a 10% maybe difference in the wine. The rest of it, 90% of it is terroir. But it's all about how you manage that terroir. When you pick it, how you decide on picking. For instance, I had my first 2021 vintage this past season, and by walking in the vineyards, picking up the flavors, as an interest where I'm heading is we harvested quite a lot earlier than I would normally. So you have to adapt. Something like I would always harvest grapes in Durbanville, 23 Blanc. I was harvesting at 20, 21 was pushing it a little bit. And that's where I thought the phenolic ripeness was lying in the wine. And I think the resulting wine is working perfectly balanced for what I wanted to get to. But definitely you are bringing some things from your background with you. There is ideas and philosophies. So something interesting that I think I've learned a lot in Durbanville is how to make wooded Sauvignon Blancs. It's something I always love doing. And a lot of philosophies around how you use oak and what you are supposed to be getting out of that oak maturation. I always find you should never really be picking up the oak, but more your stone fruit flavors and peachy flavors, apricots maybe, from aging and fermenting Sauvignon Blanc in oak. Now, one of the tools I had in Constantia Uitsig is we've got 6 concrete fermenters, and it was the first time I ever used concrete, and I wanted to bring that same idea of using oak in your Sauvignon Blanc, but without the oak influence with the concrete. So a little bit more oxygen, micro-oxidation during fermentation, a very specific yeast that I use with that. So there is definitely some ideas that was born in Durbanville area that I'm bringing over to Constantia Uitsig, and I think it did work quite well.
Well, I'll tell you what, if you want to be the judge of this yourself, nip on down to Pick and Pay and grab a bottle of the 2020 Constantia Uitsig Sauvignon Blanc, get an idea of where the wine is now, and then get a bottle in a year or two's time and see if you notice a particular difference as the guiding hand of Danie Kuelder makes its way in. Sauvignon Blanc is very much Constantia territory. We know the Sauvignon Blanc route is being celebrated at the moment, and it's a big part of the area and of the history of Constantia. I often feel, though, that because Sauvignon Blanc gets such a big punt, that we sometimes forget, firstly, one or two of the other white varietals. Now, I'm thinking particularly here Chardonnay, which does pop up occasionally in the Constantia area, but also the red wines. I'm going to come back to the Chardonnay in a moment. I want to nip over to the red, though, because we've got here your Constantia Uitsig, Constantia 2016, and across the estates. If I look just around the corner up at Constantia Glen with the 3 and the 5, which are 2 terrific red blends. Look at Beekbevachting and the Christine or the Mayford, different levels of wine, but both really pleasant red wines. There is a strong history, there is a strong tradition of red wine in the Constantia Valley as well.
I agree, and specifically Bordeaux blends. I think that is on the other side probably what we are doing well. the reason why we focus a lot on Sauvignon Blanc is that's the one thing that the one cultivar that everyone really does very, very well. But I do think there is amazing examples of Bordeaux red blends in Constantia, and I think every farm is making a very exceptional Bordeaux red. Not taking anything away from some of the Shirazes and Pinotage that's also in the valley, but I think everyone's flagship wine is a Bordeaux red on that side.
And there's certainly some great contenders. One of them happens to come from Constantia Uitsig. So let's have a look at this particular one. This is the 2016. Just on a question of vintage, 15 and 17 are still running this battle in Stellenbosch and surrounds as to which is the better of two great vintages. Already the whisperings of 2020 suggest something pretty special coming there as well. From a red wine perspective, where does 2016 sit in the Constantia Valley?
Good. 2016 for me was the first year that we really started experiencing the drought. And I think we were, as winemakers, we were still very much trying to find our feet. 2017, we knew what was coming and we knew how to handle that a little bit better. But 2016 was the one that I think it caught a lot of winemakers off guard a little bit. So you have a little bit less concentration, I think, on 2016 wines than you would on 2015 and 2017, which I agree was, for me, one of the two best vintages I've ever worked with in my life. 2016, I'm not taking anything away from 2016. I think it is a beautifully showy wine at the moment. I think it's a wine that is bringing out all sides of what is in the wine, all the different components. You can definitely taste the Merlot coming through very strong on the nose. And then as soon as you go over that Merlot tomato leafy flavor, you start getting that Constantia cab that is tobacco leaf and slight bit of matchbox as well. But yeah, for me, this wine is a very specific Constantia cab driven blend with hints of Merlot.
All right, nice little flicker of Cabernet Franc coming through as well to complete. I think it's about 10% or so, but a valuable 10% in this Constantia Uitsig. So it's another terrific Constantia blend, and there are, as Danie says, a number of them in the Constantia Valley in that Bordeaux blend space. So we've got probably the two wines that speak most to the two sides, white and red, of the Constantia offering. I know talking to you yesterday, you were chatting a little bit about your Chardonnay and things you're looking to do there. Give us an idea from a Constantia Uitsig performance as Danie Kuelder touches down and wants to move Constantia Uitsig forward. What's the direction? Where are you going? What can we expect from you guys over the next few years?
So yes, Dan, we've got really big plans coming. You know what? What's interesting for me is 10 years back when I was in the Valley, started off, I always thought Constantia Uitsig is a perfect spot for Chardonnay. And I think some of our neighbors over time has definitely proven that Chardonnay does work in this area by winning very much international competitions, etc. with the Chardonnays. But contrary to what you would expect, Chardonnay normally do like their very cold evenings because we're so close to the ocean. We don't get that same temperature variation during the maturation of the grapes. But because of the soil that we've got at Constantia Uitsig, my predecessor decided that would be definitely the right angle to take for future. And I totally 100% agree on the angle. So we are putting a lot of focus on making a very serious style. I don't want to call it a heavy Chardonnay, a balanced Chardonnay maybe, where oak balances the fruit out, but a premium wine. And then we're also we're putting a lot more focus on our unwooded Chardonnay. Now, when I was drinking Constantia Uitsig 10 years back, there was two cultivars that always came to mind for me. One is the unwooded Chardonnay that they used to make, and the other one is the Semillon. So a big part of our focus for future-wise would be going towards Chardonnay and both sides of the Chardonnay story. Something that I thought was quite interesting for me, you were asking earlier about the experience of making Sauvignon Blanc from Durbanville and bringing that knowledge over to Constantia. So a lot of the unwooded Chardonnay ideas I've had was coming from Sauvignon Blanc and making Sauvignon Blanc. Now, the interesting thing is Chardonnay does have some amount of tiles, so you can treat it very similar to Sauvignon Blanc. And I thought this harvest was very interesting and quite a big learning curve to bring over some of that Sauvignon Blanc ideas and using it into the Chardonnay production and to make a fruity style Chardonnay that I think you can very easily make in this area.
There are clearly some exciting times ahead as a newish winemaker finds his feet and starts to carve out his niche at Constantia Uitsig. Danie, it's lovely to catch up with you this evening. Thank you very much for the time. I think our last time together was up in Johannesburg over a few glasses of wine. I'm hoping the gap won't be quite so long again. Good luck with the new adventures. Keep making fabulous wine, and can't wait to see what emerges next from Constantia Uitsig. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
There we go. Danie Kuelder, the 2019 Diners Club Winemaker of the Year. He was then at Natida. He's now back in Constantia, and he is making wine at Constantia Uitsig, one of the more revered South African wine estates, been around for ages, and delivering some cracking wine, as it will continue to do so, I have no doubt, under Danie Kuelder. So that wraps us up for this evening on Dan Really Likes Wine, presented by Pick n Pay. Thank you not just to Danie, but also to Michael Fridjhon for joining us this evening. A reminder, if you aren't already, to become a member of the Pick n Pay Wine Club. Gee, it is so easy to do. Dash off by SMS your smart shopper number to 36775, and that will get you in. It's free of charge, and gee, does it give you some cool benefits. You will get for yourself 3 times the smart shopper points on every single wine, 20% off 10 different wines each month, plus there are deals on cases and on magnums. There are competitions as well. And how's this for a competition? You have got the chance to win this month over 5,000 Rand worth of Siemensig wine. All you have to do is buy a bottle, any bottle of Siemensig wine, the guys who gave us that very first bottle of Cup Classique in 1971, and you could be taking delivery of over 5,000 Rand worth of wine, in which case I'm very happy to come around and join you for dinner. So there we go. Join the club if you aren't already. A big thank you to everyone watching, amongst them Elizabeth Bardan. Thank you, Michael, who was on with us earlier, for your vast knowledge and wisdom. Fabien Letiec, is Pick n Pay delivering to Germany? Fabien, I do not think so, sadly, but I will speak to Raymond Ackerman and ask him if he can make an exception just for you. But there are a number of great platforms, Fabien, to find South African wine in Germany, and I hope you'll be taking advantage of some of them. That wraps us up for this evening. A little later on tonight, I will be joining Freddie Dias and his Portuguese-themed evening at Séjour as we try out some Portuguese food and wine. Doesn't Freddie look lovely with his Alice band sweeping that hair back? And that's dinner tonight at Séjour. Remember, up tomorrow morning, a special on the relaunch of Plaisir under Michael and Rose Jordan. And Monday night, I'll be at the home of award-winning chef David Higgs, just confirmed for season 3 of My Kitchen Rules on Mnet, as we chat to 3 of the Cape Winemakers Guild protégés, taste their wine and see what the future holds for them, and by extension, South African wine. Big thank you to Michael Fridjhon. Look out for the Old Mutual Wine Trophy results coming out in about a month's time. Thank you too to Danie at Constantia Uitsig, and I'll be back with you live on Monday night. Have a great rest of the week. Keep drinking South African wine, and thanks for supporting the show. Take care. Goodbye. To join the Pick n Pay Wine Club, simply SMS your smart shopper number to 36775. It's absolutely free, and you'll get for yourself 3 times the smart shopper points on every bottle of wine bought. You'll also get a 20% discount on 10 different wines each month, a 25% discount on a case of wine, and a magnum, some terrific competitions and invitations to awesome events.